All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Justin Essery. I'm an assistant professor here at Rice University. Welcome to the International Methods Colloquium. The IMC is a periodic online interactive seminar discussion on the application of quantitative statistical methodology to the social sciences, sponsored by Rice University and the National Science Foundation. This week's speaker is Lauren Prather from the University of California, San Diego, presenting co-authored work co-authored with Sarah Bush from Temple University. The talk is entitled An Experiment on the Use of Electronic Devices to Collect Survey Data. Lauren's talk will last between 30 and 40 minutes, after which point we will take questions from the audience. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of your webinar window. A link to Lauren's slideshow will be available in the Zoom webinar chat window so that you can refer to it throughout the presentation, and I'll post that link right after Lauren gets started. Now I'd like to welcome Lauren to the IMC. Lauren, welcome.
Hi, thanks, Justin. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to present this work today with Sarah Bush at Temple. I want to make a note as I start that this research was supported by an NSF Rapid grant to conduct a panel survey in Tunisia. And in that panel survey, we embedded an experiment on the use of electronic devices to collect our survey data. And by electronic devices in this talk, what I mean primarily is the use of tablets to collect survey data. And this is as opposed to using pen and paper to collect the same data. So I'll get started. So first I want to preface by saying that survey research in the developing world is undergoing a major shift. So primarily, surveys in the developing world are conducted using face-to-face interviews. That is to say, individual interviewers actually go door to door to conduct the survey in person with the respondent. These surveys in prior decades before the advent of tablets were primarily recorded using pen and paper. However, increasingly researchers, governments, the World Bank are recording these same survey interviews using tablets or other computer devices rather than pen and paper. What are the benefits of using these tablets? So before I go on to talk about the potential drawbacks, I just want to highlight why researchers have turned to using tablets in these developing country contexts. So first off, the use of tablets obviates the need for extensive data entry and cleaning. That is to say, when interviewers record responses on tablets, those usually go straight into some sort of spreadsheet. And so when survey research is conducted using pen and paper, you typically do need a team that can go through and actually translate that data into digital data. And then that data has to be cleaned. So using tablets actually makes this process much easier. Similarly, you don't then need to convert that data into machine-readable formats. So this simply makes the process of data collection a lot faster. But in addition to speed, you also get supposedly higher quality data. So when you use tablets, you can actually do real-time monitoring of the data quality. Typically, the data is uploaded either in real time or potentially each night. And so as a researcher, you can monitor the quality of that data as it comes in rather than waiting for the pen and paper data to get translated into machine-readable data. Furthermore, the use of tablets can actually aid in monitoring enumerators. So tablets can have GPS turned on so you can monitor where your enumerators are to make sure that they're going to the places they're supposed to be going. We know of survey companies that actually video record their enumerators sometimes, so you can make sure even if they're in the right location, that they're performing the questionnaire in the right way. And then sometimes survey firms actually go a step further and record certain aspects of the interview process, record the respondent to verify that individuals are actually interviewing the people they're supposed to be interviewing. So this type of real-time monitoring aids in the data quality. Finally, the other important aspect of tablets is that you can increase the complexity of your questionnaire. And so as survey experiments have become more and more utilized by researchers, the necessity for using computer software to implement these designs is increasing. Before, if you wanted to do some sort of survey experiment, as my co-author and I did in our first wave of our survey, we actually had the questionnaire on paper, and we had interviewers roll dice in order to implement the randomization, and then they had to find the appropriate section of the questionnaire in paper to implement the randomization. But if you're using a tablet and a computer survey program on the tablet, typically that randomization can just be automated, and that that reduces the likelihood of enumerator mistakes. So these are all the reasons why we think researchers are increasingly turning to the use of tablets in developing countries. But what we want to ask in this is, are there downsides of using tablets? So we think, based on the literature that we know of in the developed country context, survey mode has been shown to affect responses and response rates. So we noticed that no one has really studied the possible effects of using tablets on responses and response rates. So that's what we wanted to do in our project. So for the remainder of the talk, what I'm going to do is I'm going to review the literature on survey mode effects that I just mentioned. We're going to theorize then about two sets of effects that tablets could have. The first is a set of wealth-related effects, which primarily stem from the fact that in developing countries, tablets are relatively rare. And to the extent that they are in society, they're typically concentrated among those of high status and high wealth. And then a second set of effects that we think are possible are surveillance-related effects. So as I suggested earlier, tablets can be used to monitor the survey enumerators and sometimes the interviewees, but tablets can record responses even, individual respondents may think they're being recorded even if they're not. So these are the kinds of effects we think might also obtain. Next, after that, we're going to discuss the data and research design strategy, which our data context was the country of Tunisia in 2014. And essentially, we assigned some enumerators to carry tablets in the second wave of a two-wave panel survey. And then we're going to present our findings. So just to preview the talk in case people need to go eat breakfast or lunch, I'm going to just give you the punchline now. So there's some evidence in our study that the poorest respondents end up reporting higher incomes in the presence of tablets than when they're interviewed using pen and paper only. So this is some evidence of those wealth-related effects. However, we find no evidence of surveillance-related effects, and I'll talk through why we think that might have occurred. Okay. So let me just start by giving you a little survey of the literature on survey mode. So first of all, most of the literature on survey mode focuses on the United States specifically. And to the extent that it is located in the developing world, these studies have primarily focused on what's called interviewer effects. So whether or not different traits of interviewers affect responses and response rates to studies. So one set of findings that's pretty well known in the literature is that overall survey response rates, so this would be participation in the survey at all, are higher in face-to-face interviews than in telephone or online interviews. So that is to say, when someone comes to your door and asks you to participate in a survey, individuals are much more likely to participate than if they're called on the phone or if they're simply sent a link in an email and asked to participate online. So this is one set of effects that we know really well, but don't necessarily apply in the developing country context, given that face-to-face interviews are still the primary way surveys are conducted in developing countries. So The thing that we're focused on in this talk and project is that certain survey modes and interviewer characteristics activate or worsen social desirability bias. So let me first define social desirability bias. So social desirability bias obtains when respondents have a certain trait or have had an experience or simply hold an opinion that is subject to social stigma or taboo. And this bias can then be activated or more severe in face-to-face interviews as respondents seek to minimize social distance between themselves and the interviewer. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So first of all, we know some studies that show reported drug use is higher in online surveys than in face-to-face surveys. So in this context, individuals are more likely to share or more truthfully share their drug use when they're simply completing a questionnaire online and don't actually have to tell this response to a person in front of them. This makes sense as drug use is still subject to social taboo in the United States. And so if we were interested in getting a real picture of drug use in the United States, we might choose to use online surveys rather than interview people face-to-face. Another example that's maybe closer to the research that we're going to be doing in this study is the effect of interviewer characteristics on responses and response rates. So one set of studies in the Middle East, for example, has shown that when female interviewers wear headscarves during the interview process, they cause individuals to in the Middle East, again, cause individuals to report higher levels of religiosity. So again, this is evidence that individuals might be are trying to reduce the social distance between themselves and the survey interviewer because they assume by wearing a headscarf that interviewer is very religious. So we're going to be drawing on some of this research on social desirability bias and interviewer characteristics, in particular for the set of wealth-related effects that we hypothesize. Okay, so let me turn to the characteristics of electronic devices in developing countries that we think are relevant to understanding their potential effects on responses and response rates. So the first characteristic is that they're relatively expensive. So luckily, there have been a series of studies looking at ownership and usage of electronic devices in developing countries. And what you see is that there's a fairly wide variation in access and use of tablets and smartphones. And in developing countries in particular, access is increasing, but it's still relatively rare. So the fact that they're expensive means that to the extent that there is access to them, they're concentrated in the hands of individuals that are of relatively higher status and higher income. So the second characteristic that we think are relevant to survey design is that they're typically able to record audio or video content discreetly. So as I said before, this feature has been used to record enumerators so that you can monitor the interview from the point of view of monitoring the enumerator. But individuals know that it's also possible that as a respondent, they could be recorded during the interview process. And so this might affect individuals' belief that their responses are truly anonymous. And in certain contexts, this may, and for certain traits of individuals, this may induce fear among those individuals and cause them to change their responses or refuse to participate. So this leads to a couple of different hypotheses here. So first off, as I suggested, we have a set of wealth-related hypotheses. The first hypothesis is that when an enumerator uses an electronic device, such as a tablet, relatively poor respondents might be less likely to provide information about their household income. So again, this might be in an effort to minimize the social distance between themselves and an enumerator that they see with the tablet and perceive as relatively higher status or wealth. So this might cause them to just refuse to give information about their income. Alternatively, if they do choose to respond to that question, they may actually report a higher income than they actually have. And again, this may be an effort to decrease the distance between themselves and an enumerator that they perceive to be of higher income or higher status. As I've been saying, the mechanism here then is that respondents, when faced with a tablet, may assume enumerators are of higher wealth or status and therefore seek to minimize the social distance between themselves and the enumerator. So this is essentially a tablet causes interviewers to have a different set of characteristics than they would otherwise have if they were just using pen and paper. Okay, so then we have a second set of hypotheses about the potential surveillance-related effects. So when an enumerator uses an electronic device, we think respondents who oppose the government might be less likely to provide information about their support for the regime, or if they do choose to answer that question, report greater support for the regime than they actually have. So the mechanism here is not really social desirability bias. It's actually, we think, more of an emotional response, which is fear. So we think in cases where individuals think that their responses are no longer anonymous, they may think that the government could end up hearing their responses and therefore be afraid that their responses will be revealed to the regime. And so in the case of those that oppose the regime, they might be less likely to give a response when asked whether or not they support the regime, and if they do, might actually offer greater support than they actually have. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to how we test these hypotheses and the data we collected. So Sarah and I had the opportunity to run a two-wave panel study in Tunisia in 2014. So what's important to know about Tunisia in the context of our study is that in 2011, there was a revolution which started the Arab Spring, and it stemmed in part from economic stagnation and inequality, which continues to remain salient today and was definitely salient in 2014. So this suggests that these wealth-related effects, that this might be a good case to find those wealth-related effects. Similarly, prior to the revolution, Tunisians lived under a brutal dictatorship with pervasive surveillance. So Tunisia was one of these countries where the regime used the internet to monitor opposition, among other tactics that it used. And so we think individuals would be aware that tablets and the internet in general are used to surveil individuals, and therefore tablets might have this emotional effect of fear on people. But you might be wondering, well, there was a revolution, so Tunisians weren't under that brutal dictatorship anymore. But actually, what was interesting about the 2014 election was just prior to the election, a new party appeared called Nida Tunis, and one of its main features was that it included a lot of members of the prior regime. And so actually the party that ended up winning the presidency and a plurality of the seats in the parliament was Nida Tunis. And given its close ties to the dictatorship, we think individuals might still have been fearful that their survey responses would have been potentially not anonymous and had some fear that those in power might use them against them. But we want to put Tunisia in context with other developing countries so that you can kind of see whether or not the effects that we find in Tunisia might be plausible in other countries. So here we just plot on the x-axis the average Freedom House score. So this is how free Tunisia is compared to other countries. And you can see that Tunisia is actually on the relatively free side of the scale. So we might expect Tunisia to be a relatively hard case for those set of surveillance hypotheses. On the y-axis, on the other hand, we have percent smartphone ownership in 2014, and we see that Tunisia is on the lower end of that scale. And so we think Tunisia might actually be a more likely case to find some of the wealth-related effects, given that smartphone ownership is relatively low, and to the extent that individuals have it, it is concentrated in those individuals of higher wealth and status. So compared to other countries, Tunisia might be a relatively likely place to find these wealth effects, and other countries might be harder cases. Okay, so the research design was pretty cool, and actually the reason we were able to do it was simply because the survey infrastructure in Tunisia was relatively minimal at the time that we conducted our survey. And in particular, the survey firm we used only used pen and paper, and was one of only two primary survey firms in the country, both of which only used pen and paper at the time of our survey. So they were actually interested in trying out tablets, and so we thought it was a good opportunity for us to study the effects of tablets on survey responses. So the way we did this was we conducted a nationally representative panel survey. The first 1,400 interviews were conducted only with pen and paper, and the first wave went out just a few days after the parliamentary election was conducted in October. In the second wave, we were able to recontact 70% of those in the first wave to complete an interview in December, so this was just 2 months later. And what we did was that 25% of the interviews were conducted with tablets in that second wave. The way this actually came about was each survey team had, which usually consisted of 4 to 5 survey enumerators. One of those individuals in each survey team had a tablet with them. Now, you might be asking, how were the tablets assigned to enumerators? Well, unfortunately, the survey firm we were working with did not want us to just simply randomize the tablets to survey enumerators. Instead, what they wanted was the most experienced member of each survey team to use tablets. Now, this could cause some problems if you thought there were different characteristics of the experienced member that might actually cause the change in response or response rates rather than having the tablet itself. But we think we're okay on this front as long as we have balance across tablet interviewers in the wave 1 data. So we know who used tablets in wave 2, and we know what interviews they conducted in wave 1. So we can actually see if there are any differences in the wave 1 observables, and then if there are, control for those in our wave 2 analyses. We will say, though, even though the tablets were not assigned independently to enumerators, they were independent of respondent characteristics. So it wasn't as though experienced team members went to certain houses or only interviewed certain people. So even though tablets were not assigned to enumerators independently, they were assigned to respondents independently of their characteristics. But as I said, we can actually check the wave 1 observables to see when all interviews were conducted with pen and paper, whether there are differences between tablet interviewers and not. So here I'm going to show you the balance table that we created of wave 1 observables. So in the middle column here that contains the means, CAPI stands for computer-assisted personal interviewing. PAPI means personal-assisted paper-assisted personal interviewing. So what we're looking for here are differences on these wave 1 observables based on whether the interviewer in wave 1 had a tablet or not in wave 2. So what we can see is that for those observables that are highlighted in blue, here's where we see differences in wave 1. So we do see that enumerators in wave 1 that had tablets in wave 2, they already in wave 1 were interviewing individuals of slightly higher income, and this was statistically significant. We see that they were less likely to be interviewing needed Tunis supporters. So that means they were more likely to be interviewing opposition respondents. Individuals that they were interviewing also had higher levels of education and were more likely to live in rural areas, but had lower levels of political knowledge. So these are the observables in wave one that were where there were significant differences between the interviewers. But what we can do is control for those and any analysis between subjects analysis that we do in wave two. But we also, what we do in for the wealth-related effects, we actually look at within subject analyses. And so we're comparing the same individual across wave one and wave two, depending on whether or not they were interviewed with a tablet in wave two. So this is just to say there are some differences, but any between subject analysis we do using wave two outcomes, we can control for these wave one observables that we know were different across tablets and not tablets. Okay, so let me just point out one other design issue. So the second design issue is that we only know if a tablet was used in a wave two interview if the interview was actually completed. So that is to say, we don't know whether the presence of tablets at the initial wave two contact affected the refusal to participate in wave two. So essentially, we had 70% recontact rate, so that means we had about 300 respondents drop out. And we don't know if those 300 respondents were initially contacted by an interviewer with a tablet or not. So we only know whether or not an interview was conducted using a tablet if someone agreed to participate in wave two. So this, we think the implication of this is that it possibly biases against us finding our hypothesized effects. So that is to say, if someone came to my house and they had a tablet, and I either really wanted to minimize my social distance, I'm a poor respondent, and I really want to minimize my social distance between myself and the interviewer, I may just decide to not participate in the interview at all. Similarly, if I'm really fearful that my responses are going to be recorded, I may just choose not to participate. So that may mean that those that actually end up in our survey are those for whom the wealth-related effects and the surveillance effects are not as strong. So this, we think, again, might bias against us finding our hypothesized effects. Okay. So now I'm going to turn to looking at the wealth-related effects. So the first thing to show you is the distribution of income, and this is from those reported responses in wave one. So what you can see is most of our respondents, the mass of the distribution is located at the lower end of the income scale. So about 20% of respondents report the lowest income category of under 200 dinars a month. The next highest category is about 40% of the respondents, and they're reporting earning between 200 and 500 dinars. And about 25% of the respondents are located in the next set of the distribution. So what we want to look for then is among those in our poorest income category, are they more likely to report higher incomes when they are confronted with an interviewer with a tablet as opposed to an interviewer with pen and paper? And because we ask income in both ways, we can actually do a within subjects analysis and not just a between subjects analysis as we end up doing in the surveillance for the surveillance hypotheses. So I'm going to show you what this looks like first for the response rates. So we find no evidence that the poorest respondents are less likely to respond to the income question in wave two when they're confronted with a interviewer with a tablet. In fact, all but 3 of the poorest respondents from wave one chose not to answer the question in the second wave. So really, almost every one of the poorest respondents in wave one answered the income question in the second wave. So this does not suggest that there's any effect of tablets on the likelihood that respondents are going to participate in the income question. However, for respondents that do answer the question, we find some evidence that they report higher levels of income when they are confronted with an interviewer with a tablet than when they are confronted with an interviewer with pen and paper. So here, the coefficient on second wave suggests that respondents that were not interviewed with tablets, in the second wave, they actually do tend to report higher levels of income, even if they're not interviewed with a tablet. But what we see is that those interviewed with a tablet report even higher levels of income than those not interviewed with a tablet. So we're not sure why individuals, all of the poorest respondents essentially are reporting higher incomes in the second wave. But what we see is that that effect is augmented by enumerators having tablets. And here I'm just going to show you the difference in mean reported income in the second wave between respondents that were interviewed with tablets and those that were not. And as you can see, there's a significant difference in the mean reported income of respondents when they are interviewed with tablets. However, what we see is this is concentrated among the poorest respondents in our sample. So wealthier respondents don't appear to report higher incomes in the presence of tablets. In fact, we see the coefficient on the interaction term between second wave and tablets is not significant at all. And actually, respondents that were not interviewed with tablets in the second wave tend to report slightly less income. So there doesn't appear to be any effect among the wealthier respondents, which is what we would have expected because these respondents aren't as socially distant from the enumerators with tablets as are the poorest respondents in our sample. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to the surveillance-related effects. So first thing we wanted to do was measure government opposition. And the way we were able to do that is with a question in wave one that asked respondents about their satisfaction with Nita Tunis. And again, our wave one survey was conducted right after the parliamentary election in which Nita Tunis won. We asked individuals their satisfaction with Nita Tunis, the party in power, and those that reported being somewhat dissatisfied or very dissatisfied were those individuals that we coded as being opposition members. Again, I want to emphasize that Nita Tunis politicians were linked to the previous authoritarian regime. So these individuals may have been fearful that the Nita Tunis regime would use similar surveillance tactics and punish opposition members. Only about 246 respondents reported being somewhat or largely dissatisfied with Nita Tunis in wave one, but these are our opposition members and the individuals among whom we think the surveillance-related effects are going to be concentrated. Alas, we don't find any effects of possible surveillance on, again, I should emphasize, we didn't actually do any surveillance on our respondents. So this is just, this would be presumed surveillance on the part of respondents. So because we didn't ask the same question across both surveys, we only look at between subjects effects of being interviewed with a tablet or not in wave two. The dependent variable is, instead of satisfaction with Nita Tunis, is satisfaction with Asepsi, who was the presidential candidate that won the election after which this survey was conducted. So in model one, we have response rate to this question of satisfaction with Asepsi, and this is among government opposition members only. And we see that there is no significant effect of being interviewed by a tablet or by an enumerator with a tablet. And again, we're actually also controlling for some of those wave one observables that we know are different across those that were interviewed with tablets and not. Model two and model three actually looks at whether or not individuals said they were satisfied with a subsidy or not. And this was a 4-category variable. And so these are ordinal logit coefficients. What we can see here is in model 2, which is government opposition members only, we see that there's, again, no significant effect of the tablet. There's also no significant effect among those individuals who are not opposition members. So these results, we think, imply some evidence that, at least in Tunisia, the surveillance-related effects that we hypothesize are not evident. So there's no evidence that respondents who oppose the government are less likely to report information about their support for the regime, and no evidence that they change their responses relative to those who were not interviewed by interviewers with tablets. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up here as I'm getting close to my time limit. The implications of this study, we think, for survey design are somewhat encouraging. So there's limited evidence that electronic devices affect survey responses and response rates. However, we think with a fairly difficult test, given this within subjects design, that reported income among the poorest respondents was higher when they were interviewed with tablets. So this suggests that researchers should be aware of the potential bias on income-related outcomes or wealth-related outcomes, and use maybe multiple strategies to measure income. So we know that there are some ways of measuring income that don't rely on reported monthly income, for example. In fact, there are some ways of measuring income that are not subjective to the respondent, but rather subjective to the enumerator, such as observing characteristics about the house in which respondents live or the area in which they live. So perhaps combining some of these objective measures of income with reported income on the part of respondents might give some researchers confidence that they're measuring income accurately. But we do think further testing is needed in other contexts. So although Tunisia is a relatively poor country, there are certainly countries that are less well off and have higher levels of inequality. And so we encourage researchers that are considering using tablets in those contexts to think about ways to either measure the bias that's introduced by using tablets or come up with some other ways to mitigate that bias. But perhaps even more troubling for our study is the fact that we didn't find any surveillance effects, but we do think these effects are plausible and may obtain in countries with stronger authoritarian regimes or actual surveillance states. So again, just as a reminder, Tunisia, the time of our study was just after a revolution and was actually around the first democratic elections in that country. And so places where researchers are studying opinions about the regime, and that regime is an authoritarian regime, and or conducts surveillance using the internet as a weapon, then we might expect actually stronger or any effects of surveillance on responses to questions on the regime and potentially overall participation rates. So we think further testing of these hypotheses is crucial in other contexts, and we hope that this study raised awareness about these potential drawbacks to the use of tablets. So I look forward to hearing your questions, and thanks in advance for listening.
All right. Thank you very much, Lauren, for that presentation. At this point, Lauren Prather is available to take questions from the audience. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of the webinar window. And we've already had a few people choose to ask questions, so okay. I'm going to go ahead and start. Yunjung Lee asks, I wonder if the reason why you didn't find that the poorest respondents are less likely to respond to the income question is because they perceive the interviewer to be higher status and therefore an authority figure.
This is a good point. You know, I think in a future study that might replicate ours, whether we do it or not, I think it would be important actually to potentially ask questions of the respondent about their perception of the enumerators. I'm not sure that I've ever seen this done in a survey, and I'm not sure how it would work with the enumerator asking the respondent, what they thought about them. But one way to measure something like what this question asks is to actually have some questions about what respondents think about the enumerators. I think it's plausible that response rates might be relatively higher because they think enumerators with tablets have greater authority. So that's certainly plausible. Unfortunately, we can't test it with our data, but future researchers could certainly look at that.
A question about, this is a question also from Yoon about the surveillance-related model. I guess the tables aren't numbered, but I think it was the third table you presented.
Yeah.
Why don't you, he asks, why don't you use an interaction term between second wave and tablet, or even include a second wave term in the surveillance model?
Yeah, so the problem here was, or the reason we structured the analysis the way we did for the income questions was because we asked the same question about income across both waves. So for the surveillance-related analysis, we were only able to use a question in the second wave. So that's why we don't conduct this difference in difference across the wave, and also why we wouldn't use a term for second wave in the analysis. So really what's going on here in this table is that we're only looking at wave 2 responses, and we're essentially doing a between subjects design here where tablet holds the effect on tablet is what we're looking for, and we're comparing individuals in wave 2 that were interviewed with the tablet and were not. So that's why we can't use the same type of model that we use in the wealth-related effects.
Okay. I have a question from Karen Greiner.
Okay.
Thanks for the presentation. You may have answered this and I missed it, but is there a reason to focus on politically oriented questions, which seem likely to lead to a certain amount of reticence to respond?
So I'm a political scientist, and so I'm very interested in political outcomes. And so that's one of the reasons that we chose to focus on, in particular, on these outcomes. Income is not really a political outcome. We thought about looking at something like support for redistribution, which we thought could be affected by whether or not you were interviewed with a tablet. We chose in the end not to, because we weren't quite sure how the tablet we weren't sure theoretically how the tablet would inspire people to change their responses, or whether it would at all. But we think that's potentially another outcome to look at. We wanted to shy away from simply looking at whether there were differences across all of the questions in our survey, simply because we wanted to do something that was more theoretically motivated. But we certainly think there are other possible ways in which tablets might affect responses. We focused on these two, but we'd surely be interested if researchers had other hypotheses about ways in which tablets might affect outcomes.
So I have a question that's probably a little more practical than the one that you've gotten. So how well does this, my experience with technology is it works really well until it doesn't work, and then when it doesn't work, it really causes problems. Yeah. Whereas with a pen and paper, it'll always work, right? Sure. So how reliable are these? How reliable are the machines now in terms of their battery life, their ability to respond in adverse conditions, be visible in daylight, and all that kind of thing?
Sure. So I will preface this by saying this was the first and only survey I've done in a developing country context with tablets. So speaking from my own experience, I can say that the tablets were very reliable. We did some extensive training sessions. So that is potentially one other cost to using tablets is simply the startup cost to training your survey enumerators to use the survey programs. At the same time, as I mentioned in my earlier slides, because survey researchers increasingly want to do more complex questionnaires, you have to do training about how to implement the questionnaire regardless of if you're using a tablet or pen and paper. So I'm not sure I've seen a study comparing what you're talking about, Justin, whether or not enumerators have an easier or more difficult time implementing a questionnaire using a tablet. That would be certainly interesting, something interesting to study. Similarly, you could also study the reliability of these devices. I haven't done that, but I can say that there must be some greater benefit to using them, or we wouldn't see such an increase in their use by researchers. So there are always trade-offs in any research design, and my assumption and the assumption we made is that the trade-off between the ease of data collection, the ease of implementing complex questionnaires, and the ability to monitor the data in real time were outweighed by the potential loss of reliability.
The reason I brought that up was because several years ago, this was before the invention of the iPad, if that helps.
Yeah.
My colleague, Rick Wilson, did a study, an experiment, sort of a lab experiment in Russia, in Siberia, I believe. And part of the design was he toted around these early primitive tablets that the respondents were supposed to use to interact with each other. And I am told it was a disaster.
Oh, no.
Battery life was, not very good. The damn thing didn't work. And so they ended up having to fall back on pen and paper at a certain point.
Yeah.
And I, of course, I have an iPad, and it's much better than, that thing was. But I could still see, particularly, if you're in a place where, you're going to be out in the field for 12 hours.
Yeah.
There aren't outlets around every corner.
Right.
And people are maybe not familiar with the technology, and there's just a certain propensity to crash, and the network is not very, I'm sure the coverage in Tunisia of internet is not necessarily, a blanket.
Right.
And so for all those reasons, I was kind of wondering how practical this really was.
Yeah, and I think one thing we'd like to add to this paper is a survey of surveyors, so to speak, so that we can actually back up some of the claims that we have about the increasing use of tablets and the reasons why researchers choose to use tablets. Because right now you're just taking that on faith that I'm telling you that this is kind of the way in which surveys are conducted now in the developing world. But I think we could actually show that pretty easily, but we haven't done that yet.
So related to this, Yoon asked, if you before you did the study, did you do any kind of pilot or trial, investigate, whether, one thing you mentioned is, tracking of in real time of enumerators that kind of implies you have to have internet connection on a real time basis. How much, how did you know it was going to work? Did you investigate that, or did you just what did you do?
Yeah. So, I think, it depends, like you said, Justin, on kind of the internet availability. So, if you have tablets that are able to connect to the internet using Wi-Fi, and you have many Wi-Fi hotspots around, then you can upload the data more frequently to the commonly like a shared data site. The way that our survey researchers did it, I believe, was that most of the survey teams were actually from the regions where they were conducting their interviews. And so basically the survey teams uploaded their survey data each night sort of at home using their home internet connections. So this will obviously differ from context to context. As I said, we didn't pilot these actual questions and analyses But what we did do was extensive training with our survey teams on how to use the tablets. And so we were assured that they knew how the tablets functioned. I should say that the survey enumerators were really excited to be able to use the tablets. So that was sort of the piloting we did, was training them on how to implement the questionnaire and making sure that the way they implemented the questionnaire was as similar as possible to those that implemented it using pen and paper.
We have another question from Yuri No. He said, they say, I'm curious whether the enumerators who used the tablets reported any interesting comments from the respondents regarding the use of the tablets.
We would love to know that. Unfortunately, we did not hear any of those comments, and we did not specifically ask our enumerators to record any such comments. So again, I would say future study, that would be something that would be really interesting to do, would be to have the enumerators record either their own subjective view of how the interview went and whether or not they thought the tablet elicited a response from an impromptu response from the respondent, or simply even to ask respondents what they thought about the tablets.
So I just want to ask, we have probably time for one more question.
Okay.
So you're talking about doing surveys in the developing world, but
yeah.
obviously, a lot of us do surveys in the US or in the OECD or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think commonly now the kind of go-to method is the internet, right? We do some sort of internet-based survey, and we argue, well, that's fine. Everyone has a computer and a smartphone and internet and all that. Do you think that there is a reason for people focusing on surveys in the developed world to try to do face-to-face interviews with some sort of, tablet-based interface as opposed to just sending them internet links and recruiting in that way? Sure.
I think there's two responses that I would have to that question. So one would be the way in which online survey respondents are recruited has become increasingly sophisticated, and I would say is getting closer to nationally representativeness than we ever have before. So I think that's on the rise. There are also increasingly statistical techniques that can be used to try to manipulate the data into being more representative, such as using survey weights. But I do think it depends somewhat on what you're asking, right? So if what you want to know are respondents' opinions about fairly taboo subjects, if you want to measure policy views that might be subject to social stigma, or even if you want to measure things like sexism or racism, those things you might get a more accurate measure on by using online surveys as opposed to face-to-face surveys. So I think there are a lot of benefits to using online surveys in addition to simply the ease of collecting the data. But I think with face-to-face interviews, you're probably more assured that they are going to be closer to a representative sample. And you also are likely to get higher participation rates, as I suggested some previous studies have shown. So yeah, again, it's all about trade-offs and thinking about what you actually want to measure in your study. But sorry, what I should say is I'm not sure, though, that I think the effects that we hypothesize in this study, the wealth-related effects and the surveillance-related effects, are something that researchers, if they were using tablets in the US context, for example, I'm not necessarily sure those kinds of theories would apply here, but there could be other sources of bias that researchers would want to think about.
All right, well, we're out of time, so I'd like to thank Lauren for being our presenter this week. Her presentation will be posted to our website shortly after this broadcast, along with slides, if you'd like to use it or watch it again later. I also want to announce that next week, March 10th at noon Eastern, We will host a talk by Yuki Shireto of Princeton University. Yuki's talk is entitled Uncovering Heterogeneous Treatment Effects. You can see our website of www.methods-colloquium.com to get more information about this talk and see the rest of our schedule for spring of 2017. Lauren, thanks very much for giving the talk this week.
Thanks so much. Thanks for all the questions.
All right. See you next week, everyone.